Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. The year is 1936. In Europe, the Nazis are on the march, and in a sleepy college town in Bedford, Connecticut, a renowned archaeologist just back from an eventful trip to Peru receives a visit from two shadowy agents of U.S. Army intelligence. They've intercepted a mysterious message. Tanis development proceeding. Acquire headpiece staff of Ra. And when the archaeologist hears those words, his eyes widen. The Nazis have discovered Tanis, he said, one of the possible resting places of the Lost Ark, the Ark of the Covenant. And so begins one of history's most thrilling archaeological trips. And the name of that death-defying scholar is, of course, Indiana Jones. Hello, and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. And I guess I should explain this, shouldn't I? For the people who haven't watched the Indiana Jones movies, they were directed by Steven Spielberg, a series of films. Harrison Ford was the dashing archaeologist in a fedora with a whip, going about basically just discovering stuff that everybody wants to discover. And they're absolutely fantastic films about archaeology. And I think it's fair to say that archaeologists absolutely loathe them because they make archaeology seem much more interesting than it actually is. And they're conscious that their own careers are actually a crushing disappointment to the general public. And of course, Indy does this periodically when, it's the Ark of the Covenant, or he's, looking for the Holy Grail or whatever, something that belongs in a museum. So that presumably should keep. Although, of course, the question of whether artifacts should be in museums now, well, that's more of a controversial topic. If you talk about the Elgin marbles, which I did a podcast on earlier on, should they be in a museum or should they be in Greece? And it's a big question. And I have a feeling that if Indiana Jones actually existed today, he would probably be decolonized, wouldn't he? Or held in, kind of very low regard by lots of post-colonial archaeologists, because all he wants to do is put things in museums. So, on the topic of, for instance, the Ark of the Covenant, if it were to be found, where would it end up? And the question of where the Ark of the Covenant should end up is actually a live issue all the way throughout the film. And maybe the question now is, suppose the Ark were to be found, where should it really go? Who would have dibs on it? So the origins of the Ark of the Covenant, as I'll be exploring today, isn't actually the theme of today's episode. I'm not really going to so much dig into who it belongs to, because if it was discovered, I'm sure everybody, including Great Britain, would put up their hand for it. That's not the theme of today's episode. But it is a mysterious and a contested object. So where is it? So just before we go to the Ark of the Covenant, just a quick word about Raiders of the Lost Ark. So the funny thing is, I did a podcast about King Solomon's Mines, which of course was written by H. Rider Haggard. And it's a kind of classic of Victorian imperial fiction. And for me, there's a very, very obvious line of descent from King Solomon's Mines, and I think even Spielberg would acknowledge that, to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg was actually influenced by the kind of adventures that were on, the movies when he was a boy, and they in turn very overtly were influenced by Rider Haggard, absolutely, for sure. But it's George Lucas who actually came up with the idea. And actually, it's exactly the same with Star Wars. So in the 1970s, in a period of, Watergate and the American retreat from Vietnam, Lucas and Spielberg, who were these sort of, nerdy suburban young guys, they have this sort of deep nostalgia for the film serials that they'd watched as boys, in the 1930s and the 1940s, probably even in the 1950s. And they want to remake them with square-jawed, clean-cut, bullwhip-carrying heroes. And the guy who actually wrote it, incredibly, is Lawrence Kasdan. And he had actually fallen in love with cinema because he'd seen Lawrence of Arabia, which I also did a podcast about not that long ago, which, of course, is another story of a great British imperial hero. So you can see where the theme of this is. Now, interestingly, the guy who suggested to Kazdan about the Ark of the Covenant was actually his friend, Philip Kaufman, who had studied history at Chicago. So no surprise there. And in extraordinary detail, Philip Kaufman actually heard the story of the Ark of the Covenant from his dentist when he was 11 years old. He was having some kind of work done, and the dentist just told him this story about the Ark of the Covenant, and he never forgot it. And there's a fantastic sequence in Raiders of the Lost Ark where Indiana Jones is explicating what the Ark of the Covenant is to the sinister US Army agents. And the American agents, have basically turned up, as I just mentioned in the beginning, and they're asking exactly what the Ark of the Covenant is. And Indiana Jones says, well, it's the chest that holds the 10 Commandments. They say, the 10 Commandments? He says, yes, the actual 10 Commandments, the original stone tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Horeb and smashed, if you believe that sort of thing. And then he says, didn't you guys ever go to Sunday school? And I have to admit, that's where I learned all this kind of stuff. I learned all this stuff at Sunday school. This was the kind of stuff that they were telling us about. So Indy then goes on to say, the Hebrews then took the broken pieces and put them into the ark. When they settled in Canaan, they put the ark in a place called the Temple of Solomon, where it stayed for many years until all of a sudden, whoosh, it was gone. I mean, there's quite a lot of detail in that is actually wrong, but the basic outline is actually right. And I remember in the movie, they had this brilliant illustration, kind of a black and white line drawing of the ark on a hill surrounded by a blaze of light. And it looked like a kind of weapon, of mass destruction. And that's the role that the ark is playing in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And look, I may be going off at tangents here, but I tend to do that now and again. But I think what the story is actually about is a kind of a parable about the race for the atom bomb. It's a race for the ultimate weapon. There was always an element in Nazism, actually. Nazis were fascinated by the occult and by weird esoteric theories. Himmler was actually trying to find Atlantis. And what Raiders of the Lost Ark and later Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade captures is a combination of that. It's our fascination with those objects, but also, as we say, the real life race between Nazi and American scientists to build the world's first atom bomb for the ultimate weapon to win the Second World War. But of course, there is a slight tension there because, of course, it's fine for the Nazis to look for Atlantis and cast the Atlanteans, for instance, as being Aryan. But the whole point of the Ark of the Covenant is that it's very, very Jewish. And there's a point in the film where one of the Nazi officers actually says, I feel a bit uncomfortable about this. It's all a bit Jewish for me. But conversely, for the film to work, it has to be true. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant really has to be what the Bible says it is. This kind of immense repository of power, the interface between God and man. Because if it's not true, it's not what the Bible claims it is, then its value as a weapon is for naught. It means nothing. I mean, the reason Kaufman comes up with it is that they need a MacGuffin, don't they? They need something that Indiana Jones is going to go after. Otherwise, there's no movie. But by making it the Ark of the Covenant, they amplify the stakes massively because the Ark of the Covenant it's the embodiment of the power of God on the face of the earth, according to the Bible. And so if you take that seriously, then you take the plot of the film seriously. So most people probably, when they think of a biblical ark, will think of Noah's Ark and not the ark that Indiana Jones is after, because that obviously would be far too big to hide. And everybody at school, when I was at school, thought the film was about Noah's Ark. But they kind of share a similar derivation because an ark basically, well, it's a box or a chest, and it's conveniently called the Ark of the Covenant. But it actually has many names in the Bible because just to simplify things massively, the Bible is an actual patchwork of various narratives that have been stitched together to provide a kind of coherent narrative account of right from the beginning, from the creation of the world. the slavery of the chosen people in Egypt. Moses leads them out of Egypt and he goes to Mount Sinai and he meets with God, and God gives him various commandments that they have to follow. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant comes in. It's the weird thing about it, isn't it, that it's simultaneously the most important kind of object in the universe, perhaps, while also being really a very invisible presence in the Bible. And considering how important it is, you would expect it to be kind of, I don't know, popping up all over the place in the Bible, but it actually doesn't. It kind of comes in and comes out. And I think that reflects the fact that there are all these kinds of various traditions, these various different accounts of what it actually is. So basically, I think you can distinguish three separate traditions explicating what the Ark is within the fabric of what Christians call the Old Testament and Jews call the Tanakh. So in one tradition, the Ark is made by Moses in obedience to instructions given by God. And it's the place where God meets with man, and therefore it's terrifying because the Ark is actually imbued with the power of God. And to approach it is potentially lethal. So the Ark bestows life, but it also bestows death. So, for example, if you were to open it and look in it, your face might melt, as it did in the Indiana Jones movie. And then there's a much less exciting tradition, which would have made Raiders of the Lost Ark certainly a lot less dramatic, which is that it's basically just a kind of box to keep the tablets of law in. So nothing special at all. So it's kind of like a filing cabinet, if you like. I've got a box where I keep some old coins. And there's a thought process that's all the Ark is. It's a bit of a box just like that. But of course, as I said, if you have a box like that, then it's not going to get made into a movie. Then there's the sense of it, which again is really the one that you get in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is that it is a weapon of mass destruction. It's an atom bomb waiting to happen. It's something that destroys the enemies of the children of Israel. So basically, the Ark that we see in Raiders of the Lost Ark is the Ark that we get in the book of Exodus, which also includes the account of how the children of Israel leave Egypt, the plagues, the crossing the Red Sea, and all that kind of stuff. So in Exodus, we have very precise descriptions of it. It's about 4 foot long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet tall. And it's overlaid with gold. You have kind of gold rings on the 4 corners so that you can actually put poles through it and carry it that way. And on the top, you have a great thick slab of gold, which is called the mercy seat. And this slab of gold is actually topped by 2 cherubim who are kind of facing each other. And there is an emptiness between the cherubim. And cherubim, people have heard of cherubs, the kind of rosy, pink-cheeked little babies, eros, etc. But in the Bible, they're not that at all. They're actually terrifying angels. They're the angels that basically attend directly to God. So they are there, and they are there in later descriptions of them in the Bible. They're kind of winged, 4-faced sphinxes. So very alarming things, not happy, loving things at all. And the gap between the 2 faces of the cherubim is where the presence of God actually is. In the Bible, it's actually described as his heavy light, his glory, his kind of immanence. And it contains the 2 stone tablets on which the 10 commandments are written. And it's a very, very odd thing, and even by the standards of the Bible, because God actually does appear to people in the Bible. He appears to Adam in the Garden of Eden. He appears to Moses in a burning bush, and he appears in a whirlwind to Job. But it's only on this mercy seat of the Ark, between the 2 cherubim on top of the Ark, that he is routinely manifest. And this Ark is exactly the Ark that you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The gold slab, the cherubim. It's pretty much identical to how it's described in the Bible. Actually, it's probably a little bit bigger in the movie, but, that's a movie. But that's exactly how it should look. And this Ark is actually built at the foot of Mount Sinai, where all the children of Israel have gathered, and Moses has gone up Mount Sinai, and he's spoken with God. And then he comes down with the tablets of stone, which the Ten Commandments are written on. What he finds, though, is that the children of Israel have got so nervous waiting for him that they fall into worshipping a golden calf. And when Moses finds this out, he absolutely loses it. And he smashes the tablets, and there's kind of chaos and disaster. God is then threatening to wipe the children of Israel out. So Moses goes back up Mount Sinai, faces God, and says, please don't kill them all. And God kind of calms down and hands over duplicate of the original tablets of stone. I mean, obviously, he's got a lot of tablets up there, but look, he's God. He can do whatever he likes. Meanwhile, down on the plain, the children of Israel have been given very, very precise instructions on how to build a large tent that is called a tabernacle. And it's kind of IKEA cubed. If you can think of the most complicated IKEA thing, this is it. And it's incredibly complicated. And the instructions are very, very precise. So I never think of Dutch theologians perhaps as, kind of being witty. I mean, I just don't. Or German theologians, for that matter. There's one called Hermann Witzius, who in 1872 amusingly said that God created the world in 6 days, but he needed 40 days to instruct Moses about the tabernacle. I just find that so funny. So everything about the tabernacle has to be completely precise, and the ark is kept in the tabernacle in kind of a backspace, which comes to be called the Holy of Holies. Only Moses is allowed to go in there, and this is because it's incredibly dangerous. It's like going into the core of a nuclear reactor. That's how dangerous this is. And basically, if you touch it, you're going to be struck dead, and you have to follow these rules. These very kind of intense health and safety rules. You have to follow them to the letter. So Moses' brother, Aaron, he becomes one of the priests who actually tends to the tabernacle. But even the two sons of Aaron, they make offerings to the ark and they're struck down. They're not allowed to be there. The ark strikes them down. And so there's this sense, which of course is absolutely manifest throughout Raiders of the Lost Ark, that the ark is so holy that if you approach it in the wrong way, it will absolutely kill you. But also, even if you have all these very precise laws detailing how people are to approach it or not to approach it, there's also a sense that the ark has a will of its own. So in the account of the children of Israel leaving the foothills of Sinai, and they start wandering in the desert, there's this sense, as you read about that the Ark of the Covenant is kind of floating in front of them, and they have to follow where it leads. So even though you have, rings where you can put poles in it to carry it, there's also a great sense that we don't actually need to, because it will move on its own volition. It's sort of divine powers, and having, it has a will of its own. And that then reminded me of a device that sort of stood out for another, powerful kind of nuclear bomb type thing, which of course was Tolkien's ring. Tolkien's ring has this incredible power, but it also has a will of its own, and it can move sometimes, or fate can actually take it in funny directions. And of course, the big difference is that the ring is completely evil, whereas the ark absolutely isn't. The ark is the manifestation of God on earth, and that's what gives it its charge. But I talked about these different traditions, so there's a further contradiction that you may have been wondering about, which is that if people can't approach it, then why are the rings there to propose that people can carry it? Because, that's an inherent contradiction right there and then. But keep in mind, guys, the Bible is actually full of contradictions like this, and they're not resolved. And therefore, in a sense, I think kind of compounds the sense of mystery that surrounds it and makes it seem even more of an awesome thing. So when the children of Israel arrived at the banks of the River Jordan, and they have to get across the Jordan to get into the promised land, Canaan, they've been promised Canaan by God, which is full of great cities that have to be conquered. Here, there's no kind of hiding the ark away inside the tabernacle. You have people carrying it, and they're not struck down. The ark actually leads the children of Israel across the River Jordan. And as the people who are carrying the ark, step into the river, the waters run dry, and they can cross the river, the entire army, without getting their feet wet. Famously, the first city that they confront is Jericho. And the ark is taken 7 times around the walls of Jericho. And then the trumpets are blown and the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. And this is what the Nazis want the ark for. This kind of incredible power, this ability to just destroy cities. So everybody remembers the trumpets. I remember the trumpets from the school. But until I actually did this research, I'd forgotten about the ark. It slipped my mind. But it's actually the ark that brings down the walls of Jericho and not the trumpets. That's the key thing. So no wonder the Nazis are right after it. The ark plays the key role basically in the ability of the children of Israel to conquer Canaan. And the children of Israel establish themselves in Canaan. They are then kind of governed by people who call themselves judges. And that's not quite what they are. They're much more impressive, intimidating figures than the judges that we know, kind of in our world. But the weird thing is, throughout the book of Judges, which describes this period, there is no account of the ark whatsoever. It's actually as though the ark has vanished. My favorite book of the Bible is the book of Judges. I did a project on it when I was 12, and I liked it because it's got an incredible amount of battles and not so much religion. So less religion, more fighting. And I think that's why I liked it as a boy. But of course, there's no distinction between religion and fighting, is there? Let's face it. And I think the Church of England should absolutely hire me to make that point to younger people. I'm just saying. But of course, the paradigmatic enemies of the children of Israel, the people who are always remembered as the children of Israel's great enemies are the Philistines. And I think they were possibly sea people, maybe even Mycenaean Greeks who settled in the lowlands of Gaza, and because the Israelites are up on the hills, and there's kind of a bit of a grumbling going on between them. And in the biblical accounts of these conflicts, the ark makes a spectacular reappearance. And having said that, none of the judges really have anything to do with the ark in the account of the war with the Philistines. But then suddenly a judge does appear who has a lot to do with the ark. And this is a guy called Eli. And Eli has 2 sons with the tremendous names of Hophni and Phinehas. And they actually behave very badly. They're not good people. And because of this, when they suggest taking the ark into war against the Philistines, they're actually not worthy to be handling it. They don't have the requisite degree of holiness. So they do actually take the ark into battle against the Philistines. And because God wants to make a point that Hophni and Phinehas are actually not up to the grade, the Israelites lose and the ark is captured. And this is obviously a tremendous debacle. And so the news is actually brought back to Eli. And Eli is so appalled that he drops down dead immediately with the shock. So the Philistines, who captured the ark, what they do is they take it to the temple of Dagon in a city called Ashdod. And Dagon is this kind of very powerful corn god. And there is a massive statue of him in one of their temples. And they put the Ark of the Covenant in front of the statue. And when they come in the following morning, they find that the statue of Dagon has actually teetered over and is actually prostrating itself before the Ark. So they put it back up again. And the next day they come in. And this time, not only has the statue of Dagon fallen over in worship before the ark, like before, but it shattered into 1,000 pieces. And this is the power of the ark. It's very bad news. Very bad news for the Philistines. So they move it and they move it to another town. And of course, as soon as they move it to this town, terrible things happen. And the Philistines get afflicted by mice, which isn't the most terrifying thing that can happen, I have to say. But the thing that I always remember when I read this in the Bible as a boy is that they get afflicted by tumors, the most grotesque, horrible tumors. I remember reading a book actually much later, and it was all about, kind of flying saucers that had actually intervened in biblical history. And that this was actually offered as conclusive proof that the Ark of the Covenant was actually radioactive. And this is the nuclear bomb thing, right? So basically, all these tumors, all these mice, all these statues falling over left, right, and center, all this bad luck. The Philistines basically decide that they don't want to keep the ark at all. So they hand it back and they give it to the children of Israel, and it remains dangerous even for the children of Israel. So there is also this incredible verse. The Lord smote the men of Bethshemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote the people 50,060 men. And the people lamented because the Lord had smitten many of the people with great slaughter. So this sense that it is perilous, this is now kind of part of the narrative again. So basically the children of Israel have this incredible thing. By keeping it in a tent, I think they feel that there's a sense that maybe the tent isn't safe enough and maybe it shouldn't just be kept in a tent. So eventually the judges get replaced by kings. The most famous king, of course, is David. David is told by God, because of various kind of sins, he's a massive shagger that he's done. He's not the one who is going to build the temple. But even so, David is the guy who has captured Jerusalem and he makes it into his capital. And the ark is brought into Jerusalem, and David is so excited by this that he actually dances in front of the ark through the streets as it's being led through. And his wife is absolutely furious about this. This is all noted. Maybe because he was a very bad dancer, who knows? She thinks it's undignified. Almost, to me, the image that comes is, kind of dads dancing at weddings. It's just something that shouldn't happen. But the guy who builds the temple famously is Solomon. And the temple is modeled on the tabernacle, but built in stone. And so again, you have the Holy of Holies. This is where the Ark of the Covenant is put. And in the Bible, it said, it came to pass when the priests will come out of the holy place, but the cloud filled the house of the Lord. So that's what makes this temple so awe-inspiring. It's that God in some way is present within this house, within the tabernacle. And of course, it's built on Zion, on the mountain of God. And it's this that gives Jerusalem, dare I say, its sacral quality. After the reign of Solomon, you have biblical accounts of all of these kind of various kings. And the kingdom of Israel is actually split in two. So we have the king of Israel in the north, you have the king of Judah in the south, and the last king really who is described as having anything to do with the ark whatsoever is a king called Hezekiah. And he is the king of Judah at the time when the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians, who are this great, terrifying empire in northern Mesopotamia. So they come and they destroy Israel. And then they come and lay siege to Jerusalem. And that siege is defeated. Interestingly, because a plague of mice comes and gnaws away in the middle of the night at the bowstrings of the Assyrians. So effectively, they have no weapons. And then I wondered, well, what is it with mice and the Ark of the Covenant? Mice and the Ark seem to have some kind of strange relationship, and I just don't get it. Rats I would get, but of course, rats don't appear anywhere. And they don't appear in the Indiana Jones movie either. I think they actually use snakes for that, which seem a little bit more, seems that's something you would be afraid of. Anyway, I'm losing it. Let me just go to the end of the biblical account. So Hezekiah is the last figure in the Bible who is described as actually having seen the ark. And then I read what Indy said, and Indy actually said it stayed in the Temple of Solomon for many years till all of a sudden, whoosh, it was gone. So that whoosh, it was gone. I mean, there isn't a whoosh in the Bible, but that's actually what happens. The ark just disappears. And then I thought back to my Sunday school lessons, and I thought, well, maybe it was captured by the Babylonians because, they do actually capture Jerusalem. So maybe they took it back to Babylon. But the answer to that is a definitive no, because actually in the second book of Kings, you get the great inventory of all the loot that is taken from the tabernacle temple. And the Ark of the Covenant is notable by its absence. It's just not there. So it wasn't one of the items that the Babylonians captured. So where did it go? And when in due course the temple gets rebuilt because it's been destroyed by the Babylonians, the Babylonian exiles are actually allowed to come back, by the Persians to rebuild it. The rabbis, the current rabbis, looking back at this period, are confident that the ark was not in the Second Temple. And we can be pretty confident of this because when the Romans famously captured Jerusalem under Pompey the Great, Pompey actually goes into the Holy of Holies and reports back that there is nothing there. It's an empty space. There is no ark. But everything does go terribly for him from that point on. He's actually had a career of unexampled success. And then his career absolutely starts to tank. So, I agree. It's not like having your face melt, is it? Or, being surrounded by mice or, tumors. But it is a kind of judgment. Anyway, so that account, which we only have the Bible for as evidence for, what the Ark of the Covenant actually was, we have no other accounts of it whatsoever. That leaves two massive mysteries. The first is, what is the Ark? Where do these predictions come from? Are they likely to be true? And of course, the second is, where did the Ark go? Where did it end up? And what happened to it? Great mysteries that we will have a look at in the second half of the show. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Just before the break, we were talking about what happened to the Ark and, where does this kind of idea of a sacred box actually come from? Well, basically it comes from the Bible. This is our only source for it. And like so much of the Bible, it's kind of midway between history and myth, between what becomes monotheism and a kind of the pagan world from which that monotheism emerges, between Israel and the cultures in which the Israelites lived. And that generates all kind of paradoxes and ambiguities. And I think that is the reason that the Ark is such a kind of powerful symbol within the Bible, is that it's all of those kind of paradoxes that surround the way in which the Bible came to be written. They're actually mapped into the paradoxical nature of the Ark within the fabric of the text. To me, that makes sense. It's the power of the Ark within the fabric of the narrative, the biblical narrative. And it owes a lot to paradoxes and ambiguities of how the Bible actually came to be written. Now, here's the question. I would guess as a complete outsider, a novice, there must have been other kind of cults, as it were, other people in the Levant in this period who would have had boxes or thrones or sacred things. And I was thinking, well, maybe this was actually just one of those. So the Egyptians, for instance, they definitely had sacred chests. And it's the Egyptians, of course, that the children of Israel defined themselves against. So they would never acknowledge that. And perhaps that's part of it. We know that the Phoenicians, who are important in helping Solomon build the temple, that they had chests that they actually carried about in chariots, important chests. So presumably they have a kind of holiness to them as well. No? So there's a wonderful book that came out, I think, a couple of years ago called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavropoulos, who's professor of biblical studies at Exeter. And she is interested in the idea that the kind of trace elements get within the biblical narratives of God as a kind of human figure, so a physical figure. So the idea of Moses going up Mount Sinai and looking in God's face, this is actually meant literally, she argues. So she argues that the ark may originally have been a footstool. It was kind of understood as being the receptacle on which God's feet rested. And that's very much a contested perspective, but it's possible as well. But that idea derives from the Egyptian tradition of placing covenants, law codes, at the feet of their gods, which they did. So there are all these kind of various traditions bubbling around. But the honest truth is, we actually don't know what the ark was. But certainly, the Ark of the Covenant lies at the heart of something that is absolutely crucial to both Jewish and Christian understandings of their relationship with God. That's without question, which is the idea that the tablets of stone do actually form a covenant. And this is very important because it's a covenant, a bond between the children of Israel and God. And this, in the context of antiquity, is absolutely unique. Gods in the ancient world serve as witnesses to governance. The idea that people could have a covenant with God is something wholly exceptional. And so, I think the holiness, the paradox, the ambiguity that hedged the art of the covenant around are reflective of the almost kind of blasphemous quality of the covenant. You know, the idea that humans and the divine can be joined in something like that is, by the standards of the ancient Near East, very, very shocking. And when I say it's a covenant, I mean a covenant is a two-way thing. So what is God actually promising to do? What's his part of the bargain? Well, I think that's simple. He is going to love us, and he's going to look after us, and he will protect us. And periodically, if we break the covenant, then he will punish us, but he always does it in a kind of spirit of love. And it's the fact that it's written down, that it's a contract, that makes the Ark so incredibly special to Jewish and Christian believers. It's this idea that an all-powerful God combined himself contractually is fundamental to the development of both Jewish and Christian theology. Because, for instance, it means that it makes it much easier for Jewish and Christian traditions to fuse with the inheritance of Greek philosophy, because philosophy essentially is an attempt to fathom the laws that govern the universe in the way that laws govern a city, right? I mean, you'd have to agree with me with that. So there's this idea that you have in Plato, in Aristotle, in the kind of philosophical traditions that pass into the Roman period. But it's possible to fathom the universe in terms of laws that govern it. And this is something that Jewish philosophy provides as well. So you have this guy called Philo. I think he's an Alexandrian, philosopher in the 1st century AD. And he's absolutely obsessed by the Ark of the Covenant as a kind of symbol of the fusion of Greek and Jewish traditions. This idea that the universe can be fathomed because God has laid down laws and God himself will obey those laws. And in the long run, this is enormously influential. So I think in that sense, the Ark has to be a lot more than just a weird box that gets carried around. I think it's genuinely powerful. I mean, it's ideologically powerful for sure. And the power does not preside in melting people's faces, but it does in a sense of the sacredness of the contract. The idea of a covenant as being something binding, something very special. And it may be that the impact of that is heightened by the fact that the Ark itself vanishes. So in a way, the idea of the Ark as the interface between God and man is a kind of physical expression of this idea that God has bound himself contractually. This becomes something metaphysical rather than couched within an object itself. So that then raises the question, and we've almost come full circle, what happened to the Ark? So there are all these kind of theories about this, and lots of these theories are actually, very ancient. So one theory is that it got carried off by the Egyptians, specifically a king who in the Bible is called Shishak, who was probably a pharaoh by the name of Shishonk the first. I think they're the one and the same people. And that, of course, would make it possible that the Ark in the Raiders of the Lost Ark is that it's outside Cairo somewhere. So presumably that's where Philip Kaufman got the idea from, because remember, he did history at Chicago. So maybe that's what he was drawing on to come to that idea. Another idea is that it got hidden by one of the kings of Judah before the Babylonians came to keep it for safekeeping, that it's hidden somewhere in the Holy Land, somewhere in the desert, and they just forgot where they put it. So it's out there somewhere waiting for an archaeologist to actually dig it up. Either an archaeologist or, as the Bible says, it will be revealed at the end of days. I mean, okay, you can take your pick. And then there was a very specific idea that it's actually been hidden by an angel in a rock. So that would actually make it a challenge to find. And there's the very controversial, certainly if you're Jewish, theory that was proposed by the Samaritans, who, if you remember, they hated the Jews and the feeling was entirely mutual. And they claim that it's actually hidden on Mount Gerizim, which is in the Holy Land. And of course, that's a sacred mountain to the Samaritans. However, what is the impact of the absence of the Ark of the Covenant on the way that the Jews and the Christians come to understand their own covenant with God? So the Jews do not forget the Ark of the Covenant. And we know this going into the Roman period because there's a frontier town called Dura Europos. And it kind of almost, these days, it would sit on the border of now of what is Syria and Iraq. And of course, back in the day, that was the border between the Romans and the Persian empires. And so Dura Europos gets destroyed by the Persians in 256 AD. Remember, this is where they think the Ark is, and soil and rubble fall on top of the entire town. And it gets almost perfectly preserved. And there's this incredible synagogue that's been found there that's been decorated with the most stunning biblical scenes. And of course, in a very unique way, because famously synagogues, they tend not to be illustrated with stunning scenes at all, but this one is. And it shows the Ark being carried away from the temple of Dagon. But what's interesting about the way that the Ark is portrayed in this painting is that it doesn't correspond to the description of the Ark that you get in the Bible, rather to the image of the Ark that you get in synagogues. And in this Ark, you get the sacred scrolls, the Torah scrolls that embody the first 5 books of the Bible. And I think that you get a sense there that what the rabbis come to call Shekinah, which is the presence of God in a place. And so archetypically, it had been present on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And now that the Ark of the Covenant has gone, and obviously by the 3rd century AD, the temple is gone as well. It's been destroyed by the Romans. Therefore, the Shekinah, the presence of God, is something that actually can be experienced by the Jewish people without reference to something that is physical, be it an ark or a physical building. They now don't need the Ark. The Ark's important, but they don't need it. And the rabbis say that the Shekinah is present whenever someone studies Torah, whenever someone is reading the scriptures, or indeed when, 10 people are gathered together in prayer. So there's a sense that the joining of the divine with the mortal is something that has been divorced from the kind of awesome specificity that the art represented, and has become something that all Jewish people can actually now participate in. And you actually have a kind of rather similar idea in Christianity, where St. Paul preaches a new covenant, a second covenant that Christ has ushered in. And that covenant is written on the heart of each individual believer, which means in turn that it's the individual Christian, or indeed the assembly of all Christians, the equation of the church, that has become the Ark itself. It's symbolic. So it's kind of been abstracted. It's just become a symbol. And of course, I love the idea that the Ark is this fantastically interesting symbol, but I'm more keen to know where the Ark itself is actually hidden. Had it been taken by the Templars, or, by someone more exotic? So the rabbis, even as we are basically saying, but the Shekinah, can be manifest wherever there are 10 people gathered to pray, they do also have traditions that the Ark is in Rome, and that it got captured by the Romans when they sacked Jerusalem. And they then took it to Rome, and that it was kept in the Lateran Palace, which was the palace of the Pope before the Vatican. Unfortunately, that palace burnt down in the 14th century. And there's one tradition that says that the Ark was in the palace when it got burnt down. But of course, there is another tradition that it's still in the Vatican basement. Of course it is. And this is the stuff that I love. I know it's hidden down there. There are so many amazing things hidden down there. Or, the other rumor that the Rosicrucians have got it, of, somebody of that ilk. Surely. But it's still out there. But of course, there are other theories too. Some people think that it's in Ireland. So ages ago, on the other podcast I was doing, There's Always Tea, I did a podcast on the Stone of Scone, which is a magical stone that all of the Scottish monarchs have actually been crowned on. And of course, I suggested in that podcast that the stone of Scone could actually be the pillow of rock on which Jacob, rested his head. Well, of course it is. Let's go with that. I mean, it could be true. And that was actually brought to Ireland by an Egyptian princess. Well, there are traditions that say that she also brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ireland with the stone of Scone. I mean, two massive things, right? She would have had a huge entourage. The stone itself weighs half a ton at least. And of course, then there's the Ark. So quite the entourage. And if you believe those traditions, they said that the Ark and the stone were actually brought there and buried with the high kings of Tara. I don't know whether these traditions are obviously true, but there were a group that thought they were back in the 19th century, a group who were called the British Israelites. And they became very, very excited by this fact. And the British Israelites believed that people in Britain and Ireland are actually descended from the lost tribes of Israel, the 10 lost tribes who were carried off into exile by the Assyrians, where they then discovered the kingdom of Israel. And of course, then they vanished. And they believe that they ended up in Ireland. So between 1899 and 1902, the British Israelites start digging it up. So they arrive at Tara and they just start digging. So Irish nationals get terribly upset by this, which you can understand, and so does W.B. Yeats, the great poet, and he writes to his electorate and protests to the Times. But his girlfriend, or the woman he's madly in love with, Maud Gonne, accompanied by Sir Arthur Griffith, the leader of the Sinn Féin, they go to Tara proclaiming their opposition to the British Israelite excavations. So the excavations get stopped. So, of course, they never find out whether the Ark of the Covenant is actually buried there, but it may still be there. And, of course, then there is another story about Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the best, I think, and certainly the most extraordinary, the most credible, and certainly the most ancient of these traditions that says that the Ark actually got carried away from Jerusalem, carried away from the Holy Land, and is kept in a wholly different location. And this tradition is actually vested in the ancient text called the Cabra Nagast, the glory of the kings. And the story that it tells, patiently delivered from the biblical accounts, gives a kind of an interesting spin. It's kind of a spin-off to the franchise. So what it says is that Solomon builds the temple and puts the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies at the heart of the temple. He is famously visited by the Queen of Sheba. This is all very kind of H. Rider Haggard, isn't it? And she is absolutely aware that the Ark is there and the traditions based around it. And, H. Rider Haggard, just to give you a bit of an example, was obsessed by the Queen of Sheba and the stories that surrounded her. So according to the Cabra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba travels to Jerusalem. She visits Solomon, and she's converted to worship the God of Israel. She's due to go. Solomon, who is basically a massive lech, and, we have biblical evidence of this, he was also a massive shagger, kind of tricks her into sleeping with him on the night before her departure and gives her a ring to give to her son so that he will be able to recognize his heir. I mean, obviously she falls pregnant, and it's a bit like the legend of, Theseus and Aegis. He just leaves signs for Theseus so that he can come and find him. So the son of Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, he's called Menelik, and he's born in Ethiopia. He reaches manhood and he goes to Jerusalem carrying the ring that Solomon has given him. Solomon recognizes him and Solomon gives him a blessing. Menelik then goes home and goes off in great honor. The firstborn sons of the elders of Israel accompany him as his escort. It's hugely important. However, unknown to Menelik, his Ethiopian followers have removed the ark from the temple. And the moment this happens in Jerusalem, dogs start howling, asses start braying, people start bursting into tears, even though they don't know why they're weeping. So effectively, they've stolen the ark. And Solomon, who is famous as the wisest man in the world, he twigs that there's something wrong, something's happened. the evidence is stacking up, all these braying donkeys and so forth. And so he goes to the Holy of Holies and he realizes that the ark is gone. He understands then that Menelik has probably taken it, and he tries to stop Menelik. But at this point, the archangel Michael intervenes, and he scoops up the ark and Menelik and his entire company of men, and he takes them to Ethiopia via Egypt before Solomon can even leave the Holy Land. And Solomon is so upset by this that he basically goes mad and starts worshipping idols. And this is very bad form. Meanwhile, Menelik has arrived in a mysterious city called Debre Makeda. And here he becomes king in his succession to his mother. And because he has the ark, he's able to defeat all his enemies. So that's the weapon of mass destruction again. And a prophecy is given that in due course he will defeat the power of the king of the Romans, conquer Constantinople, and subdue the Jews. And I guess you'd have to say that prophecy is still running because it hasn't happened yet. And something else that hasn't happened yet is that Christ hasn't returned. And only when Christ returns will the ark leave Ethiopia and go back to Zion, to Jerusalem. So that's the story. And it's viewed by Ethiopians as their great national epic. The idea that the ark in Ethiopia is taken incredibly seriously by a great line of emperors, the last of whom, Haile Selassie, was deposed in 1974. So they all take it very seriously. And there's actually a church in Ethiopia in a place called Axum, which actually claims to have the ark, even though that church itself has been destroyed and rebuilt several times in the ensuing 1,000 years. And the line of Haile Selassie going back, all these emperors, they've all been crowned there. And every year you have a great celebration in Axum to mark the coming of the ark to Ethiopia. But you may also be wondering, where did this epic come from? And it's incredibly mysterious. So there's a lot of debate about when it was written. And the most popular theory is that it's written early in the 14th century when Haile Selassie's dynasty, that dynasty that Haile Selassie will actually become a part of, comes to power. And so it's called the Solomonic dynasty because they claim legitimacy from their descent from Solomon. And the idea is that this epic is written to give legitimacy to the story based on that dynasty. And that reference to Constantinople, I guess that's a bit of a dead giveaway too, isn't it? Because, to overthrow the power of Constantinople suggests that it might be medieval, except not early 14th century, because by the early 14th century, Constantinople itself is actually a shadow of its former self. And also, there's no kingdom of Jews there either. However, there is a kingdom of Jews across the Red Sea from Ethiopia in southern Arabia in the 6th century. And this makes more sense because this is also when Constantinople was in the age of Justinian. And of course, Constantinople during the age of Justinian was absolutely in its heyday. So, other parts of the theory, I think they come from the 6th century, which actually means that this is an incredibly ancient story. And one of the other factors that suggests that this is an element of truth to this is that there is no mention of Islam. Ethiopia is a Christian kingdom surrounded by Muslim powers. You would think, if it had been written in the 14th century, that there would be some allusion to that, to those other Muslim powers in the prophecies, but there isn't any at all. So it's kind of an open question. But what the issues are around when this epic was written, I suppose the buried core, the thing that people will be most interested in is, well, does it actually preserve an authentic tradition that the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Ethiopia? So Graham Hancock is a great friend of the show. So he was the East African correspondent for The Economist. So he knew Ethiopia very, very well. And in 1992, he wrote a book called The Sign and the Seal, The Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And this was his kind of pivotal moment from being a journalist who wrote worthy articles and books on economics and famine in East Africa to kind of becoming a bit of a mad writer about pyramids and Atlantis and all that kind of stuff. And he actually proposed in the book that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, and he actually said that it was removed from the temple by Jewish priests at a time when the priests felt that the kings of Judah were not to be trusted. He says that it was removed to a Jewish cult center in Egypt in the 5th century BC, but it was then removed from that cult center in Egypt by Christian priests and taken to Axum in the 5th century AD. And there's I'm being very flippant, but there's a hell of a lot of underreported removals taking place here. I'm just saying, but there is more. Of course, there's more. So we mentioned that the Knights Templar. Well, Graham Hancock's theory is that the Knights Templar were searching for the Ark of the Covenant, and that the Ark and the Holy Grail are actually one and the same. And I have to say that if they are that, then I'm certainly not doing a podcast on the Holy Grail, because all I'll be doing is repeating this again. But here's the thing. Here's the other thing that Graham says. He says that the papacy was very nervous, that the Knights Templar might get hold of the Ark of the Covenant and unleash its awesome power. And this is why they were destroyed. This is why the Templars were destroyed in the 14th century. I'd never heard that story before, but that's what Graham's come up with. And it's what a tremendous story it is, and why would it not be true? I mean, it could be true. I mean, look, it's great fun. And I remember reading it way back then and being completely convinced. I don't know. I mean, it's tremendous stuff, so it could be. And look, you might think that this is all just harmless fun, except for the fact that the priests in Axum, who don't really speak English and they don't have the internet, and they don't really know what's going on in the world of conspiracy theories and Netflix, documentaries, are suddenly completely bewildered by the massive international upsurge of interest in the Ark of the Covenant and what may be kept within the secret depths of their church in Axum. And there's a very good book on the Ark of the Covenant called, surprisingly, The Ark of the Covenant by two scholars called Roderick Grierson and Stuart Monroe Hay, and they write about it. They write that the clergy who would have spoken openly about the great relic in Axum are now nervous of doing so, and those who will speak to old friends are often anxious that their names remain private. When Graham Hancock wrote his book, he had not intended to disrupt the lives of the Axonite clergy, but this is undoubtedly the result. The great success of the book in addressing the readership who would otherwise know very little about Ethiopia and whose interest in the relic in Axum and was part of the general curiosity about the lost relic of antiquity has produced a kind of crisis. So that was all written before the collapse of Ethiopia and, of course, the civil war that's then taken place since. As ever, there's a kind of anxiety about what might be going on in Axum and Ethiopia in general. So if indeed the Ark of the Covenant is there, maybe it's in danger again. Maybe it needs an Indiana Jones to again help the priests of Axum out. And I mean, definitely not to remove it to a museum. I suppose now it would actually be remiss of me, after telling you this entire story, to not then tell you what I personally think happened to the Ark. So here we go. I'm not convinced the Ark ever existed. I think you can kind of back project this idea that is so important in the Old Testament as we have it, this idea of a covenant between God and man, this idea that it's physically embodied in tables of stone, and where would these tablets of stone be kept? And you can see how you might end up constructing a narrative that is drawing on various kinds of Near Eastern traditions. So maybe it's entirely fictional. If it's not fictional, I imagine it just gets destroyed at some point. Maybe the Babylonians, maybe they destroyed it. Maybe it was destroyed in one of the church fires. I honestly don't know. Or is it actually sitting in an American warehouse emitting a very strange hum where it was put by members of the US Army Intelligence Unit in 1936? Thanks for listening in, guys. Bye for now.